Let's talk about another problem now with the church at Corinth. And this had to do with the behavior of the women in the assemblies. You think that could be a problem? Well, it was in Corinth. I can imagine a city like Corinth had some brazen women in that city, and Paul had to address this. And so we're going to look at what he's done. The culture's different. It may not be all that different, but there's some difference here in the culture we've got to look through and find the principles and know the principles still apply. And by seeing how this is addressed here in Corinth, maybe you can avoid some problems that we could have today. And I'm going to bring one of those up at toward the end of this. I think an application that may be more current today on some of these principles. So let's look at this. We're looking at the problems and questions at Corinth. Those are the problems. Here are the questions. The behavior of women in the assembly, the first part of chapter 11. Now I'm going to begin over here in 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 12. We've got some very clear instructions regarding women in the assembly. He says, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, but then later, but I suffer not a woman. Okay, the men, that word is a male. It's not just the general term for mankind. It's a specific term for men. They're to pray everywhere, but now here's the contrast. I suffer not. That means I don't allow the woman to teach, nor usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. Some of the words here might be a little difficult. Usurp, that's too strong a word. It's really, they're not to exercise the authority. I've heard some say, well, the elders told her to do it, and so she's not usurping authority. Well, it's talking about her not exercising that authority in any matters, what that's talking about. And the silence here, we'll get into that back toward the end of the lesson. It doesn't mean she can't make any sound. It has more to do with her demeanor than it does with her voice. And the word might better be translated with quietness. A quiet demeanor is what this is talking about. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But what Paul says there, he's not going to contradict in the book of when he writes to the church at Corinth. And he doesn't contradict it within that book as well. Now this one's a little more involved, and we'll get to it later when we come to this part. But this has to do with 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35. Let your women keep silence in the churches. Now it's a different word for silence there. This means don't say anything. Let your women keep silence in the churches. It's not permitted for them to speak. They're commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they'll learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's a shame for a woman to speak in the church. Well, there's some particular things about this in regard to the miraculous gifts that we're going to bring up. But what he is saying here is not inconsistent with what he had spoken or written the church at Ephesus about, and it has to do with the behavior of women. Now keep that in mind when we come to 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 5, where it says, but every woman that prayeth or prophesieth. And the question comes up, well, wait a minute. What are these women doing praying in the assembly? What are they doing prophesying in the assembly? I'm going to show how this is, it's not talking about woman preachers. I'll say that now, but I'll explain that as we get into this. Now, this has been difficult to try to reconstruct what is going on in the church at Corinth and associate it with something that we can associate with. And there's a lot of different theories about how to do that. I understand that. But I think I got a good understanding of this. When I went to Israel, they took us to a place called Magdala. It's one of the cities around the Sea of Galilee. Mary Magdalene, well, that means Mary from Magdala. This was her hometown. And as they were going to build I think it was a hotel down there on the Sea of Galilee, and they got to doing some excavating, and they called the whistle. We've got to stop. And look what we have found when we began to remove this earth. They found a synagogue at Magdala that dates back to the time of Jesus. You know, Jesus went about all Galilee preaching in their synagogues, and here he is in Mary Magdalene's hometown, and they found a synagogue that dates right into the time of Christ. They found one of the synagogues where Jesus would have taught when he was preaching in the synagogues of Galilee. Well, that is fascinating. I'm going to take you into that synagogue and show you something. Here's what it looks like. Now, I want you to notice the seating. It's not auditorium style like we have. It's more, they're seating in a square. Do you see that? They're seating in a square. And then there's several levels to that square. Now, you got to remember, this has all been taken down, and they're excavating it, and this is what they have found. You might see, if you look carefully, some of the patterns on some of the floor, but that's how they would sit. It'd be this square. People sit in the square, and sitting up, everybody could pretty much see each other in this synagogue seating. Now, I've got the arrow pointing to the stone there in the middle. It's called the Magdala stone. The original stone is now in a museum. This is a copy. They didn't want to, it was so precious, they didn't want to leave the original stone out there. So they made a replica of it and set it out there. And on that stone, if I could get up close to it and show, there's a place where you could set the scroll on either side, these grooves, and then you would turn the scroll to get to where you wanted to read. And it's right there on that scroll. You can see that. Now, when they set that replica up, they set it too far away from the seat. You see the other arrow pointing to the seat. That's where the man would sit that would read from the scroll. And the guide explained to us that they called that Moses' seat. Well, that brought to mind a scripture. Jesus says, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Well, what are they doing there? Well, that's where they would sit when they would read from the law. And so they just called it Moses' seat. Now, he says, all things whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. That's because they're reading from the law. It says, but do you not after their works, for they say and do not. They'll tell you what the law says. They'll sit in Moses' seat and tell you this is what we need to do. It says it right here in the law, but then they don't do it. So don't do what they do. You know, when someone says, don't do what I do what I say, that's usually pretty good advice. Now, it's hard to take, isn't it? But usually it's good advice. They're saying better than they're doing. And so they sit in Moses' seat. Here's what they would do. They'd gather in that square. A scribe would read from the law. And after reading it, they would discuss what was read. The men and the women would sit there together. And the women would discuss, along with the men, what was said when they would read from the law. It reminds me of the way we do our classes. You know, when I teach a class in here, women aren't speaking up during the sermon, but the men aren't either. But if I'm teaching a class, you have the idea, well, I can ask a question if I have one. Or I know something the scriptures say that I think would be significant to the class. I'll bring that out. And men and women do that together when we're having a class, don't they? But I tell you, in these synagogues, the women didn't sit in Moses' seat. You see, there was a difference. A man could sit in Moses' seat and read from the law, but the women, while they could discuss it, they weren't sitting in Moses' seat. Well, that would have been violating decorum. That wouldn't be right. So, take that now to Corinth. And let's talk about what Paul is going to say in Corinth. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances as I delivered them unto you. Paul, when he would preach the gospel and establish the church, would leave them with ordinances. That word is also translated traditions. He would hand down to them the things that they were to observe and do. And they would observe and do these things when they would assemble together. And so Paul was teaching them how to worship when he was going from city to city establishing these churches. And he praised them. They're keeping the ordinances. Now, they've got some refinements to do. They're not keeping them all just right, but at least they're trying to do what Paul told them to try to do. Now, I'd have you know, he's going to establish a principle here. Now, I'd have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. You see how that rolls out down under there? You've got God and Christ and man and woman. Now, he's not talking there about how one's necessarily superior to the other. Christ is not inferior to God. He is God. But Christ, in being submissive to his Father in heaven, that wasn't demeaning to Christ. In fact, we honor him for that. Man, when man submits to Christ, it's not demeaning to man. We honor man for that. And in that order, then there's woman in that role for man. It's not demeaning to the woman. It's not making the woman second class any more than it's making Christ second class to God. But that's the order that God here established. And it says, every man praying or prophesied having his head covered dishonoreth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head. For that is even all one as if she were shaven. Covering the head. Well, the custom was that when the women would go into the assemblies to worship, they'd have their head covered. The men, they wouldn't do that. Is that foreign to us? Not so foreign as you might think. You remember, some of us do, that Alabama coach, Paul Bryant, when they would have a football, he had that checkered hat, you know, but when they would have a football game and one of those astronauts, he wouldn't wear his hat. Said, why don't you have your hat on? Said, Mama taught me not to wear a hat inside. You know, what if I came in here and I said, okay, I'm going to preach tonight. And here I'm up here preaching. You'd think, well, wait a minute, what's he doing with that hat on? We just don't do that, do we? And it would look disrespectful, wouldn't it? Now, I've always been taught you take your hat off when you go inside. I don't think that always applies at Nedley's. I see people sitting there eating with their ball caps on, you know, but I might have done that too. But Mama always taught me, now you take your hat off when you go inside. That's just what men do. And to come in here and leave your hat on, that's dishonoring the assembly. You're not using good decorum there to do that. Well, what about the women? Well, you cover your head. Now, the women, see, I'm going to use my coat here. They would have a covering. It'd probably be more like a scarf or some kind of covering on their head. Okay? So the women would have their heads covered when they came in. Now, my grandmother always wore hats to church. I mean, that's just what she did. And I don't know if it was so much a religious thing for her as it just was a custom thing. She grew up in a time when women went out in public like that, they wore hats. She had beautiful hats. I mean, she would decorate them with flowers and birds and peacock feathers. And you know the old style of the hats. And for a long time, women just wore hats when they went out in public and went to church. And they would wear them right during services. And some would look at this and say, well, that's what they need to do. They need to wear a covering on their head. That's not the covering he's talking about, a big, beautiful, gaudy hat. But that's what some women were doing in my grandmother's time. So we're not so far removed from customs similar to that, are we? Now, what about men praying and prophesying? Well, having his head covered, he dishonoreth his head. But what about the women? But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth. And that's why they say, see, the women were preaching. The women were preaching in those assemblies. But that's not what it says. Now, a couple of things about prayer. Sometimes prayer is just put as a synecdoche for worship. You might want to look that word synecdoche up. He's talking about a time of worship. They don't worship with their head uncovered. They come into the worship and they cover their head. But also when we assemble together and males, lifting up their hands to lead the prayer, you know, the women are praying. Every one of the women. They're supposed to be praying. The men are leading the prayers, and the women are praying while the men are praying. But they're not leading the prayer. They're not sitting in Moses' seat. Well, what about prophesying? Well, women would have spiritual gifts. And if they had a message from the Lord, they could tell you that message. But it doesn't say they were preaching. Prophesying is not just preaching. We read about Isaiah going right into the bedroom and prophesying to Hezekiah on his sickbed. He wasn't standing there preaching to him, but he was delivering the Lord's message to King Hezekiah. If a woman knew something the scriptures said that pertained to what we were studying in class, it would not be out of place for her to bring that up and point us to that and tell us. And if a woman had a spiritual gift of prophecy and says, well, I have a message from the Lord, and tell us what that message was, that wouldn't be the same as preaching. Now, it wouldn't be right for her to go take over Moses' seat to do that. But she could do that in a manner that was proper and fitting. And so, she prays or prophesies. Now, every woman that prayeth and prophesied with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head. You keep your veil on, ladies. Keep your covering on. Don't look like a man and take it off to do that. Don't be brazen in this. Maintain modest decorum when you have something to offer to the discussion. It said, if a woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. I tell you, you take a woman caught in adultery, they could shave her head, and it'd be a shame for her. And he's saying it's just like you. If you walking in the assembly and you got something to say, and then you start showing us your head, why, you ought to be just as ashamed as if you've been shaven. And so he's emphasizing the impropriety of doing that when they do something like that. Now, a man indeed ought not cover his head. See, there's a difference for the men and the women here, just as there is today, a difference in the public decorum of men and women. It says, a man ought not need to cover his head, for as much as he's the image and glory of God, but the woman's the glory of man. For man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. That's God's order. He made Adam first. And out of Adam he took a rib and made Eve for Adam. He made the woman for the man. It gets back to the order that God had established. And that serves as a precedent that carries all the way into our public behavior when we're assembled together. It says, for this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels. Now, what is that talking about? Because of the angels. When we're studying angels downstairs, and we were talking about that this morning, and I'm not sure I know exactly why that's so important because of the angels, but it does tell me something about angels. Angels are watching what we do. Angels are paying attention to our behavior. Angels have an interest in God's creation and in man in particular and how God's going to deal with man. We talk about things that God has planned for man that angels had desired to look into. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but we should. When we gather together to worship God, angels watching how we behave ourselves. If angels are watching how we worship, we ought to watch how we worship. I remember Tom Holland talking about how Christ is with us in the worship. You say, what if he was really here? Would it change how you worship? What if worship was starting and you knew who he was, and he came in and sat right down beside you, and now you're going to worship? Would it change the way you worship? Don't you think you'd be on good behavior? And then when you sang those songs about Jesus, how would you sing those songs? Alas, and did my Savior bleed, and did my sovereign die? And he's sitting right there. How would you sing that song? Well, we need to be aware. We're in the presence of God when we worship, and we're in the presence of Christ when we worship, and we're in the presence of the angels. And if that's how important worship is to the angels, how important is worship to us? We might think about that. And worship with the idea, the angels are watching. It's important to them. It needs to be important to me. But then he goes back to where he was after inserting that. He said, nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things are of God. God's the one that set this up. God made man first. Out of man, he made a woman. And now all men that are here have been born of a woman. So God has established this order, and that carries all the way through to our behavior to this day. Judge for yourselves. Is it calmly? Look at that word calmly. I was watching the old movie with my mother last night, Gone with the Wind. I can't remember the name of the bossy maid that they had, and Scarlett was going to do something, and she said, it's not fitting. It's just not fitting. Well, that's what calmly means here. Is it fitting? Is it fitting that a woman pray to God uncovered? Is that fitting? Is that calmly? That's just not right. That is untoward behavior here. It says, does not even nature itself first, look at what is accepted as what is fitting, as what is comely. First, it's not fitting. Second, look at nature itself. Doesn't that teach you that if a man have long hair, it's a shame to him, but if a woman have long hair, it's a glory to her? When a woman has that veil on, when she's covered her head like that, it kind of looks like hair, doesn't it? I mean, don't I look pretty up here like that? It kind of looks like hair. It's not that the covering he's talking about here is hair, but it resembles that. And if God wanted women to go around uncovered, why would he have given them that hair to start with? That hair is like a covering. Now just go ahead and cover your head when you're out here in public like this. And then, if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. Now, he calls it a custom. Here's what he's saying is, well, what if someone's going to make someone's going to cause trouble over this? Someone's going to find some reason and say, oh, yeah, but the women ought to be uncovered for this. I just think it ought to be all right for a woman to take their covering off and then cause a problem. Listen, don't be contentious. Just let them know, well, that's just not how we do things. We don't have a custom of women coming into the assembly to worship with their head uncovered. See, it's a custom, but we don't have that custom. We don't have that custom. And so we're just not going to do that. That's what Paul is saying. That's just not fitting and proper. Now, look at the principle there on behavior. Behavior. I'm going to make a modern application, but first, before I do, let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. Where he says, I will wherefore that men, that's males, they're to pray everywhere, lifting holy hands without wrath and doubt. You know why you lift up your hands? Well, you get attention. That's why you're doing it. Some people think they're going to sit out there in the pews during worship and lift up their hands. I've even seen people lift up their hand, turn around and see if anybody saw them. Well, is that the proper way to get attention? But if you're leading the prayer, you need people's attention. Sometimes I've been in assemblies where they've called on me to lead a prayer, and I've been sitting out in the middle of the pew where I couldn't get out. And when everybody's standing, I'll lift my hand and let them know, okay, I'm going to pray. They know where I am and I'm praying, because you got to get attention. And so men are to do that. But now look what it says about women. In like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel. They're not trying to get attention. It says this, with shamefacedness and sobriety. Now, I'm not talking about broidered hair, golds or pearls, costly array, but that which becometh women professing godliness with good works. Women, clothe yourself with good works. That's becoming. That is godliness. That shows reverence for the worship. That way. The word shamefaced is very interesting. Compare that to the lifting up of hands. The word shamefacedness. You get back to the roots of that word, it has to do with downcast eyes. Now, we've got some women that will naturally do this. I'm not going to test it, but if I were to call their name out and point to them here in the assembly, you know what they're going to do? They don't want the attention. They don't like people looking at them like that. So they'll just take their eyes down. There's a lot of difference in lifting up holy hands to get attention and downcast eyes, isn't it? It doesn't mean you literally have downcast eyes or literally hold your hands. It doesn't have to mean that. It's talking about the difference of behavior of those leading the worship and the women that are in that worship that have a different behavior. And then it goes on and says, let the women learn in silence with all subjection. That is a quietness. It's a quietness of demeanor that is talking about there. And I suffer not a woman to teach nor usurp authority over a man, but to be in silence. Now here, the principles here. And let me talk about something that is happening in some places today. That we need to apply some principles here. Can a woman serve at the Lord's Supper? When we travel, I've gone to websites and looked, and I've seen my brethren, and I've seen where they had women up there waiting on the Lord's Supper. Why would they do that? I tell you, the Lord's Supper is not the time to make a statement. That's not what that's about. Why would women want to wait on the Lord's table? Everybody looking at them. They say, well, they're not exercising authority. They're just passing the plate. I mean, they can pass it when they're sitting down. Why can't they pass it when they're standing up? So they got a legalistic argument for this. And they're not exercising any authority to do this. They're just serving the supper. Can you imagine a scenario where that might be acceptable? Now, that's not the way we do things, is it? Imagine a scenario where that might be acceptable. Well, let me tell you about my mom and daddy. When they quit going to worship, they wanted to take the Lord's Supper on Sunday. Dad sit in his lift chair, and Mother go back in the kitchen and get the Lord's Supper ready and bring it to him. I'd go over Sunday afternoon, and Dad says, where we go to church, the women serve the Lord's Supper. Well, she is not being brazen to do that, is she? What about go out in the mission field somewhere and you don't have a good place to meet and there's just a few Christians and you're sitting around the table and you're worshiping. It's time to take the Lord's Supper. And it would be very natural for one of the ladies to say, well, it's right here, and go up over to the counter and get it and bring it to the table, wouldn't it? And that would not be That would not be something that would be immodest. In fact, you probably wouldn't even notice it if you wasn't thinking about this. So I can imagine that. And they say, well, she's not exercising authority. Go back and look at the text. It does talk about exercising authority, but that's not all it says. It talks about modesty and shamefacedness and sobriety and that which is becoming and that which is reverent and that which is quiet. So how does that apply? Well, best thing for these women to do is to sit down and let the men serve the Lord's Supper, isn't it? And not get into some contention about it. If anyone be contentious, we just don't have that custom. We just don't do that because it's just not proper for that. So that's how you apply those old principles to things that are happening today. I've known ladies, in fact, I know some to this day, that they don't have a good conscience worshiping without a head covering. I know one lady, and I think I know the background to this, but she wears a headband when she comes to worship, just a little headband. And she does it because, well, I think I know why. I think I know what's behind that. It's her conscience. I've known some women that have made little doilies, the color of their hair. And as worship begins in a real quick movement that's not drawing attention, they'll just cover their head. And you wouldn't even know if they had a covering on their head. It's the same color as their hair. And they're not trying to draw attention to themselves. And I have seen ladies flip out gaudy bands and hold it up there and let it float down. And that is immodest. I mean, you can do this thing exactly wrong. But there are those that have a conscience about this. And there's nothing wrong with them following their conscience in this regard. But I think we can look at this, as Paul said, it's in the area of a custom. And in Corinth, it just would have been improper for that to have occurred. And so he's applying those principles. And those are principles that we need to apply today. Let's take our worship very seriously. Let's don't get lax and careless when it comes to worship. If the angels are watching, we need to be watching. And we need to be conscious. And make sure our worship is pleasing to God and not distract our worship to other things. We're not trying to worship to make a public statement. That's not the purpose of the Lord's Supper. And that's not the purpose of our worship anyway. Now we need to be Christians. It's the Lord's church that is called to worship Him. We need to be added to His church. And then our worship is acceptable and pleasing unto God. So if you need to respond to the invitation, you can do it while we stand and sing.